You've probably seen the videos or read the articles that Katharine Hepburn had a fake accent or Katharine Hepburn used transatlantic speech. Now, this isn't entirely right and it's not entirely wrong, but I think there's a story that matters more, and that's the history of her vocal training, her breath work, and voice production. Now, this history is not always going to be squeaky clean. Sometimes we'll see that it's exclusionary, but if we stick with it, we can begin to see that we are products of history in the making. And so my hope is that we can approach it with grace and critical thinking. Today, I am going to teach you how we can listen to a historical voice by examining Katharine Hepburn. We'll trace a few of the historical and educational threads that led her to have her real dialect that you hear in the films. We'll learn about how voice was actually the thing that she was concerned about throughout her career. And then in a second follow-up video, I'll teach you how to recreate a historical voice, and we'll start with hers. When I was 16, I painted a picture for Katharine Hepburn, turned it into a greeting card, wrote her a handwritten note, and mailed it off. And to my delight and surprise, she wrote back a note addressed to me and said, "Thank you and good luck." That meant everything to me because since I was little, I deeply admired her individuality, her strength, and her acting. Katharine Hepburn's unmistakably sharp and precise voice was shaped by her time in college, where she studied with Samuel Arthur King at Bryn, Mawr. Samuel Arthur King wrote a book on good articulation. In the introduction to that book, he writes about an address that Henry James gave at Bryn Mawr in 1905. Now, Henry James lived in a time when America was rapidly shifting, and many intellectuals at the time felt stuck between what they would have labeled the Old World and the New World. Henry James had this deep affection for Europe, and at the same time, some of his favorite characters, like Isabel Archer, were uniquely American. In the address he gave at Bryn Mawr, The Question of Our Speech, Henry James laments the slipping in American pronunciation with a few examples, like the change from yes to yeah, and even worse, yup. Ironically, he critiques the intrusive R in phrases like, "Is Papa upstairs? Is Mama in the parlor?" Which is amusing since the intrusive R is a key feature of received pronunciation, the accent of esteem in England at the time. Maybe he just couldn't hear the sounds. Despite his flawed ear, James saw eloquence as a cultural and moral force. While Henry James dreamed of a coherent culture through speech, George Bernard Shaw took this further, advocating a unified, coherent accent to break down class barriers. An idea this playwright dramatized in Pygmalion, which was later then turned into My Fair Lady. In My Fair Lady, speech becomes a gatekeeper for class and identity. These stories remind us that behind every standard of good speech is a set of values, often unspoken, that tell us who gets to belong. Katharine Hepburn, of course, was deeply aware of how she sounded and even turned it into a joke.
I see that in addition to your other charms, you have that insolence generated by an inferior upbringing.
Just watch her spar with Ginger Rogers in Stage Door, insisting upon her proper English.
Fancy clothes, fancy language, and everything. Unfortunately, I learned to speak English correctly.
And that brings us back to Bryn Mawr, one of the places where Katharine Hepburn's voice was shaped. Remember Samuel Arthur King, Kate's speech professor in college? The New York Times has an article, What Diction Tells, about King in 1911. King is stated as saying, "Young women, why do you consider so deeply the shades which trim your new Easter bonnet? Young man, why take so much thought to the shading of your neckwear? Bonnets may come and go, scarves may come and go, but the lights and shadows in your conversation, the shading of your diction will go on forever and mark you as a cultivated or uncultivated man or woman." Later in the article, the author writes that Mr. King is from Bryn Mawr, and while one may get all shades of bonnet ribbons at any milliner's and rainbow lots of neck scarves at almost any shop, it seems that Bryn Mawr is about the only college shop for correct diction. Like many elite institutions of the early 20th century, it was built inside systems of exclusion and racism, defining proper speech and culture through a narrow lens that marginalized many voices. At the same time, Bryn Mawr also showed progressiveness for its era. In the 1920s, it founded a summer school program aimed at working-class women, offering educational opportunities that many otherwise wouldn't have had. This tension between exclusion and outreach reflects the layered history behind the training Hepburn received. Institutions, like people, are full of contradictions. So when we hear a voice like Hepburn's, we hear influences of privilege and progress. When Katharine Hepburn Kate first graduated college, she was cast in a series of plays in Baltimore. She would notice that when she was nervous, her voice would tighten and the pitch would rise. A fellow actor in the shows, Kenneth McKenna, recommended that Katharine go to New York and study with Frances Robinson-Duff. Notice this has nothing to do with dialect. In the Atlantic article that came out in 2013, they say that Katharine Hepburn went to Frances Robinson-Duff to correct her accent. She actually went there to learn about vocal production. Frances Robinson-Duff's mother, Sarah Robinson-Duff, was a famous operatic singer, and she had wanted her daughter to actually go and learn to act and become an actor before she began teaching voice to actors. So while Sarah, mom, taught opera singers, Frances specialized in teaching actors. She was specifically influenced by the Delsarte method, which had an emphasis on physical gesture, emotional connection. Duff emphasized the connection between body and voice, breath and sound. In her autobiography, Me, Katharine Hepburn describes some of the vocal lessons she had with Robinson-Duff. To quote, she says that Frances Robinson-Duff would, in her words, have me put my hand on her diaphragm and hold it there as she pursed her lips to blow out a candle. Kate goes on to explain that at that time she never really understood the connection of producing sound from the diaphragm rather than from strain in the throat. Kate wrote the book in her 80s, and she says that now she finally got it. Kate explains, now I can call, hey, straight from the diaphragm, but my lack of success with really connecting my voice and volume to the diaphragm cost me great worries in my career. She reveals that voice was the problem, not dialect. When Kate was cast in her first big New York production, The Big Pond, she biffed the first performance. She writes, overconfidence flooded in. My voice went up. My tempo increased. I became very difficult to understand, too high, too fast. The next day, Frances Robinson-Duff had to call Kate in. She informed Kate that she had been fired from the production. Kate didn't give up. She began to work harder and with a tenacity that shows incredible strength. And here's the turning point. What truly ignited Hepburn's imagination, what changed her voice, wasn't a theory. It was a person, Hope Williams.
Don't let's talk about him.
Hope Williams was a Broadway star of the 1920s, and her style was direct and unpretentious. She spoke in a way that felt real. It wasn't only well spoken, it felt alive.
I've been writing.
Hepburn also admired Williams's androgynous style. In her book, Hepburn writes, Hope Williams had a lovely New York accent, a forthright manner, great good looks, a slim figure, a boy's haircut, and a walk. Her walk was an arm-swinging stride. When Hepburn was understudying Hope in The Warrior's Husband, she began to develop her own voice. When she would go on, she learned that she couldn't just do everything Hope did because she wouldn't get the same laughs. Hepburn writes about this again in her book. She's quoted as saying, Hope obviously had a tremendous influence on my career. Vocally, walk-wise, I incorporated a lot of Hope into my so-called personality. It was in the air, that boy woman. Kate was inspired by Hope, but she didn't really shine until she began to make her voice her own. In response to Katharine Hepburn's performance in The Lake, critic Dorothy Parker was famously quoted as saying, Katharine Hepburn's performance ran the gamut of emotion from A to B. That critique stuck. Her work was seen as too rigid and cerebral. So what did Kate do? She got a new teacher, Susan Steele, who taught voice, and they worked together. Kate explains their work in her book. They talked about vocal troubles. They rehearsed scenes that caused the most tension. And she goes on, and voice, ever voice. So you see, it's not dialect, it's voice, ever voice. Later in her book, Me, Katharine Hepburn describes the journey of her voice and talks about losing it later in her career. So she says that she lost it in The Warrior's Husband and needed to do more voice work because she was pushing her voice too low. And then later on, when she was hired to do The Millionaires on Broadway, she was losing her voice through strain. She opens up about working with Alfred Dixon. She writes that the central idea of the whole thing was to get off the vagus nerve, which, when one is excited, scared, as actors are most of the time, makes one tighten up one's neck and throat and stop the natural flow of air from diaphragm through a relaxed passage. My tendency had apparently always been to grab with the throat. Right off, I understood what he was talking about. I'm sure Duff and that bloody candle were the same idea in essence, but at that point in my life, I didn't get the message. That moment of recognition that voice work wasn't about correctness, but about release, that was a turning point. These technical choices, breath, pitch, rhythm, they're not just random, they're not accidental. They were hard-won over a fierce, tenacious career. They came from hard work and a deep curiosity about the mechanics of the voice. So whether it be her studies with Frances Robinson-Duff to her later work with Alfred Dixon, Kate Hepburn was fascinated with the voice. Late in her book, Me, is an entire chapter dedicated to the voice. It was something that she struggled with her entire career. It wasn't about accent, it was about vocal production. Her accent was shaped by the privilege of her childhood, her education, and her college studies at Bryn Mawr. She did specific exercises like Duff's work with the diaphragm and imagining blowing a candle out, or later Alfred Dixon's work with release and understanding how to overcome your nerves. You can actually see the DNA of the exercises she did in the current voice work today of people like Linklater and Rodenberg. These aren't just traditions that come out of nowhere. They have a deep, long history. So when we study Katharine Hepburn's voice, we're not just studying a style. We're learning about the history of voice pedagogy through the years. Voice training, like most traditions, was a part of systems that also excluded, omitted, and erased. It defined good speech through narrow lenses. But here's the other truth. Inside those systems were real people like Hepburn. People who worked relentlessly to make their voices expressive, specific, and alive. They wrestled with breath, nerves, resonance, and release. Katharine Hepburn's voice isn't a joke or a quirky affectation. It's the sound of a woman trained to breathe, to think, and to speak her truth with force and precision. And when I hear that voice now, I still think of that little girl who wrote that card, and I think of how right she was to admire that conviction. If you want to learn how to embody voices like Katharine Hepburn's or how to listen to historical speech without mimicry, stick around. There's more coming. Historical breakdowns, practical vocal coaching, dialect examination through film, and deep dives into the lost lineage of American vocal training. When you learn to listen to a voice in its historical context, you never hear it the same way again. And for that, I sign off and say, thanks, Kate. You were great.